Welcome, everyone. We're still doing neurology. Now we're going to be looking at the ventricles. And the ventricles are important because this is where we have the flow of what we call cerebral spinal fluid, which is abbreviated as CSF, cerebral spinal fluid. This is fluid that circulates from the brain down the spinal cord, down to the sacrum. The sacrum pumps it back up to the brain. So oftentimes they'll call it and refer it to the craniosacral pump. Many DOs, which stands for Doctor of Osteopathy, many DOs, right? When you go to the hospital, many of your doctors will be either MDs, Jane Doe MD or Jane Doe DO. DOs are doctors of osteopathy. DOs originated back in the late 1800s. They were manipulating the human framework with the intent to increase lymphatic flow and blood circulation. And they believed if you increased blood flow and lymphatic circulation, you could rid the body of many diseases. And, years later, DOs still exist. Back then, they didn't prescribe drugs. They didn't do surgery. They didn't believe in vaccinations. They were all against their primary principles of early osteopathy. Today, fast forward many years later, many DOs tend to be holistic. Many still do manipulate, but many of them are primary care doctors that are pediatricians, that are obstetricians, gynecologists. So, you'll take a closer look now when you look at the name on the white lab coat, look to see if it says MD or DO. Now you'll know what it stands for. But many osteopaths or DOs do what's called craniosacral work, which is a subtle form of manipulation by feeling the pulses of the flow of cerebral spinal fluid. You can feel a little bit of that flow on infants, on babies, when you put your hand on the top of the head before the cranial vault starts to close off. You can actually feel the pumping of the CSF. So we have these two ventricles. They're called lateral ventricles, and that would be lateral ventricle 1 and lateral ventricle 2. Over here is lateral ventricle 3, and down here at the bottom would be lateral ventricle 4. So there are 4 ventricles. It's just the lateral ventricles are 1 and 2. 3 and 4 are more centrally located. And it doesn't matter whether the left one is ventricle 1 or the right one is ventricle 2. It could be either way. There's no delineation between 1 and 2, but the 2 ventricles on top are the lateral ventricles. Now, the flow of cerebral spinal fluid goes from the lateral ventricles, and it has to find a way into the third ventricle. So the third ventricle is here. And in order to go from lateral ventricles 1 and 2 and to find their way into 3, it has to go through this drainage system or ductwork that's called the interventricular foramen of Monroe. The interventricular foramen of Monroe. That's what they call that. Interventricular foramen of Monroe. Now we're going to take it, we're just going to rotate it a little bit so we can see the 2 lateral ventricles. We can't really see the interventricular foramen of Monroe because it's between these 2 ventricles, but you can now see the third ventricle. And now for the CSF, or the cerebral spinal fluid, to go from the third ventricle and make it down into the fourth ventricle, it's got to go from 3 to 4 it's got to go through this drainage system or ductwork called a cerebral aqueduct, also called a cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius or Sylvia. They're both acceptable. Cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius or cerebral aqueduct of Sylvia. They're both acceptable. And then after the fourth ventricle, there's some drainage or exit routes here. Let's see if the next slide covers it. Yes. So after CSF gets into the fourth ventricle, it can flow through the median aperture, or it can exit through the lateral apertures. And the median aperture, this is going to lead itself right into the central canal, which is right in the center of the spinal cord, right in the center of the spinal cord. Let me see if I can show that to you. So let's see if I can bring this up here. Give me a second. Okay. Hopefully you can see right here, right in the center of, here is the gray matter. It looks like the H. And right there in the center is a little hole. That's called the central canal. So that is how and where the cerebral spinal fluid is going to flow after it leaves the median aperture. It goes into the central canal.